The alien known as Salith of the Virexian Concord had ruled half a star system without ever once being touched by kindness. On her world, Virexa, love was not a concept taught to children. It was considered inefficient, an emotional instability that led to hesitation, rebellion, and weakness. Virexians were raised in communal towers, ranked by genetic value, and assigned lifelong roles before they could speak in full sentences. Affection was replaced by duty, compassion by obedience. Salith had been born different. Her skin bore faint, luminous fractures, silver lines that glowed softly when she was stressed. Among Virexians, such markings were seen as flaws, remnants of unstable ancestral mutations. They disqualified her from mating programs, elite command, and social prestige. She was tolerated only because her intellect tested far above the planetary mean. So they made her useful. By the age of 30 cycles, Salith had become the interstellar liaison emissary, the face Virexa showed to other species. Not because they respected her, but because if negotiations failed, she was expendable. She knew this. She had always known this. That was why, when the Galactic Assembly summoned her to the capital station Aurelian Spire, she expected nothing more than the usual, cold stays, calculated words, and the constant awareness that she stood alone. She did not expect a human. The Aurelian Spire floated between nebulae like a crown of light, its vast chambers filled with representatives from thousands of worlds. Species of flame and crystal, silicon and sound, gathered to debate trade, borders, and war. Salith entered the grand concourse alone, her ceremonial cloak hanging stiffly from her shoulders. As always, conversations quieted. Some aliens stared openly at the glowing lines beneath her translucent skin. Others averted their gaze in thinly veiled disgust. She moved with practiced stillness, ignoring them all, and took her assigned place on the lower tier of delegates, far from the central council ring. She stood. No seat had been allocated to her. This was not an error. Standing was a reminder of her rank, of her worth. Salith folded her hands behind her back and waited. That was when a voice spoke beside her. "Is this seat taken?" She turned sharply. A human male stood there, holding a datapad in one hand and gesturing casually to the empty seat beside her, a seat reserved for senior delegates. His hair was dark, his expression calm, and his eyes curious, not fearful, not judgmental, just curious. Salith blinked. "That seat is not assigned to you," she said carefully, "nor to me." He glanced at the insignia on his jacket. Dr. Elias Morgan, Earth Science Coalition, Observer Status. He smiled slightly. Observers are allowed some flexibility. She hesitated. "You will attract attention." He shrugged. "Story of my life." Before she could respond, Elias sat down, right beside her. At her level, equal, a ripple of murmur spread through the chamber. Salith's luminous markings flared bright silver. "You should move," she whispered urgently. "You risk diplomatic reprimand." He leaned back, completely at ease. "Why?" "Because I chose a seat." "Because you chose me," she replied. That gave him pause. He looked at her, not at her markings, not at her rank display, but at her face. "Is that a problem?" No one had ever asked her that before. She stopped. The truth pressed against her chest, unfamiliar and sharp. "I am not accustomed to being chosen." Elias nodded slowly. "Then let's start there." For the first time in her life, Salith sat through an assembly session without standing. As debates raged around them, Elias whispered observations, quietly translating human idioms and political nuances she hadn't encountered. He asked her questions, not about Virexian resources or military strength, but about her. "What do you think of all this? Does it ever get lonely, representing a whole world by yourself? What do you wish they understood about your people?" No one had ever cared what she wished. At first, she answered cautiously, giving rehearsed diplomatic responses. But Elias listened with genuine interest, nodding, asking follow-ups. When she faltered, unsure how to phrase something emotional, he waited. Never rushed her, never corrected her. When the session adjourned, delegates rose and dispersed. Sailors remained seated, unsure what to do. Elias stood and offered his hand. "Care to walk?" he asked. Her eyes dropped to his hand. Physical contact between species was rare. For her, it was unheard of. "I am unfamiliar with this custom," she admitted. He withdrew his hand gently. No pressure, just an invitation. After a moment, she nodded. "Yes, I would like that." They walked the outer promenade, stars spilling endlessly beyond transparent alloy walls. Sailor found herself speaking more freely than she ever had, about Virexa's rigid caste system, about her childhood isolation, about how she had learned early that affection was a resource she would never be granted. Elias listened in silence. When she finished, she expected pity. Instead, he said, "That's not a flaw, Salith. That's survival." Her breath caught. "You used my name. I asked earlier. You told me. I remembered." Something inside her fractured, then rearranged. Their meetings became frequent, always public, always innocent. And yet, they caused a quiet scandal. Other delegates noticed how the human always chose to sit beside the Virexian emissary, how he deferred to her insights, how he laughed at her dry, carefully measured humor, how he spoke her name as if it mattered. Rumors spread. The Virexian High Council summoned her via quantum relay. "You are compromising your image," the Council Prime said coldly. "Humans are emotionally erratic. Their attention weakens your authority." "I have not violated any protocol," Salith replied evenly. "You are seen," another counselor snapped. "That is the problem." They ordered her to distance herself. She did not comply. For the first time in her life, Salith made a choice not based on survival, but desire. When Elias noticed her distress, he did not demand an explanation. He simply sat beside her, as he always did, offering presence instead of solutions. "Why do you do this?" she finally asked. "Why sit with me when it brings you scrutiny?" He thought for a long moment. "Because when I first saw you standing alone," he said, "it felt wrong, like watching royalty forced to remain unseen." She turned to him sharply. "Royalty?" "Yes," he said softly, "not because of power, because of dignity." No one had ever spoken that word to her. Dignity. Her markings glowed, not from stress this time, but from something warmer. The crisis came without warning. A border dispute erupted between Virexa and a neighboring system. Accusations flew. Military posturing followed. The assembly chamber filled with tension thick enough to choke on. Salith was called to speak. She stood, alone again, and delivered a flawless, logical address advocating de-escalation. It should have worked, but prejudice drowned reason. Whispers turned to shouts. A motion was raised to suspend Virexian representation pending internal reform. It was a political execution. Salith felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. This was how it ended. She had known it would. Then Elias stood. Observers were not supposed to speak. "I object," he said clearly. The chamber erupted. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply spoke about fairness, about the hypocrisy of judging a species by its treatment of one individual, about Salith's consistent dedication to peace. "And if this assembly truly claims to value unity," he concluded, "then perhaps it should begin by asking why an emissary who has done nothing wrong has been forced to stand alone for so long." Silence fell. Slowly, delegates began to sit. Seats were reassigned. Salith was no longer alone. After the session, Salith confronted Elias in a quiet corridor. You risked your career, she said, her voice unsteady. For me. He met her gaze. I did what felt right. That is not logical. He smiled gently. Love rarely is. The word echoed between them. Love, she repeated. I do not know how to recognize it. That's okay, he said. We can learn together. Or not at all. Your choice. She studied him, this strange, fragile, brave human who had sat beside her when no one else would. I believe, she said slowly, that love is when someone sees you as you are and chooses you anyway. Elias's eyes softened. That's a pretty good definition. Then, for the first time in her life, Salith reached out and took his hand. The silver lines across her skin glowed brighter than ever before, not as flaws, but as stars. Years later, historians would mark that moment as the beginning of a quiet revolution, one that reshaped Virexian culture and redefined interspecies relations. But for Salith, it was something simpler. It was a moment she learned that even in a galaxy built on hierarchy and fear, love could begin with a single human choice. To sit beside someone like they were royalty,